Chapter 1.
The first signal. Richard was 63 and retired, a communications engineer who once thrived on the thrill of decoding chaos. Now he lived alone in a small coastal town in Maine. The streets felt abandoned. Cafes were shuttered, and the familiar hum of daily life had been replaced by an almost suffocating silence that weighed on him every morning. The silence would occasionally shatter when his radio blared news about the endless pandemic, yet even those voices sounded distant, as though the world had moved somewhere else and left him behind. His home was a strange shrine to who he had been. Radios stacked on shelves, tangled wires like ivy across the floor, manuals piled high, soldering irons resting in half-finished projects. The clutter was not disorder to him. It was a museum, a reminder of what he once was and what he still wanted to be. That night, past midnight, Richard adjusted a long-range antenna with tired but stubborn hands. Suddenly, out of the static, a series of sharp beeps broke through. They were precise, deliberate, and unlike anything he had intercepted in years. Not the usual emergency chatter, not amateur codes. Something deeper. The sound jolted him awake. His chest thudded as he scribbled down notes, tracking the subtle shifts and patterns. The signal repeated again and again, urgent, like someone knocking on the door of his lonely life. He barely slept. At dawn, he opened his laptop and typed an email with a nervous energy he had not felt in years. Message was for Helen, 61, a librarian who loved radio waves as much as he did. Years ago, she had helped him crack an obscure transmission from the Cold War days, and since then, she had been the only one he trusted with strange signals. Her reply came within the hour, fast, almost breathless. This is fascinating and unsettling. These patterns are intentional. We should investigate together. Richard's pulse quickened. For the first time in months, maybe years, his life felt charged with possibility. The silence that had swallowed the town no longer pressed so heavily on him. The signals were a summons, and he felt the old fire awaken. Adventure was calling. Chapter 2. Decoding the past, they plunged headfirst into the work, driven by something stronger than curiosity. Hours passed in encrypted calls, both of them poring over dusty radio logs, scanning through cryptography manuals, pulling data from archives. It felt like slipping back into the energy of youth. The static, the scribbles, the guessing, the laughter when one of them made a wild connection. Soon, they realized the signals weren't random at all. They pointed to places, coordinates buried within the patterns, and those places weren't just anywhere. They aligned with recent disappearances in town. People no one had talked about loudly, but people everyone had quietly noticed were gone. Their first destination was the abandoned lighthouse that loomed like a ghost above the rocky coast. The fog hung heavy that day, smothering sound pressing against their clothes, making every step a cautious echo. Inside the lighthouse, among rusted metal and scraps of paper that whispered of forgotten work, they found an envelope hidden under loose boards. A photograph fell into Richard's hands. A face he recognized. His missing neighbor. A man the town had almost stopped mentioning. That discovery sealed it. This wasn't a curiosity anymore. It was danger. And it was personal. Between decoding ciphers and chasing leads, Richard and Helen talked. Not just about the work. About when they were young, about the first radios they built, about the friends who had slipped from their lives, about the loves they lost along the way. The tension of the mystery wound itself around them, pulling them closer until the space between investigation and intimacy began to blur. Chapter 3. Shadows and the fog. Their nights stretched longer. It became their rhythm. Richard on the road, antenna set, notebook ready, chasing coordinates. Helen at her home, guiding him through secure messages, her voice steady even when he heard her breath quicken. One night the signals led him to a shuttered marina. As he scanned the shadows, he noticed a van with its engine idling. A figure sat inside, watching him. His pulse hammered as Helen's voice whispered in his ear through the phone, "Stay calm. Observe. Do not provoke them." The van rolled away, and Richard followed at a cautious distance. It led to a warehouse near the docks. Inside, hidden behind heavy doors, they discovered a stockpile of documents, cryptic devices, and rows of photographs. The missing faces staring back at them, frozen in paper while their absence screamed louder than any broadcast. Every step pulled them deeper into danger, yet something else grew in equal measure. Trust. They laughed when they cracked a code, laughed too loudly sometimes, almost as if mocking the fear that gripped them. Every glance, every word between them carried more weight. The fog might have been heavy, but together they carved through it. Chapter 4. The Hidden Network. The puzzle began to stretch wide, connecting threads that chilled them to the bone. It wasn't random criminals. It was a network, built in the chaos of the pandemic, exploiting fear and silence. Local officials mixed with opportunists, criminals with shadowy figures who knew how to bend communications to their will. Helen found patterns in old broadcasts. Richard unearthed symbols hidden in routine transmissions. Together, piece by piece, they traced the signals to the last place either of them expected. Beneath the very library where Helen worked was a secret office, tucked behind stone walls, a world hidden in plain sight. Inside they uncovered diaries, photographs, coded files, objects left behind by the missing. Stories carved into the silence, crying to be heard. The investigation wasn't just work anymore. After long nights, they would wander the empty streets together, letting the cool wind sting their cheeks. They found a cafe still open, dimly lit, serving only 2 customers who barely noticed the rest of the world. Meals turned into stories. Whispers turned into confessions. Their partnership became something neither of them had expected. Chapter 5. Close Encounters. The night was heavy with the smell of rain. Richard drove alone toward the signal's newest coordinates, his headlights cutting through the dark like blades. The town's abandoned schoolhouse loomed ahead, its windows broken, its hallways rumored to be filled with ghosts of laughter that had long since gone silent. He parked and stepped out, his breath quick and sharp. The building creaked as if alive, floorboards groaning under the weight of forgotten years. Inside, his flashlight flickered across lockers, torn posters, scattered desks. Then his blood froze. Figures moved in the shadows. Tall, masked, deliberate. They stepped toward him with the slow certainty of predators. His mind screamed to run, but his feet refused to obey. The world seemed to close in. One figure raised a hand, not in greeting, but in warning. His phone vibrated in his pocket. Helen's voice rushed in, breathless yet controlled. "Richard, listen to me. Do not fight. Move toward the east corridor. There is a service passage. Now." He obeyed, heart pounding, weaving through crumbling walls and collapsing doors. The masked figures followed, footsteps echoing like drums of war. He stumbled into a stairwell and nearly fell, but Helen's voice carried him forward, steady as a lifeline. At last he burst out into the night air, chest heaving, soaked in sweat. The figures did not follow. Whether they had decided to let him go, or were planning something worse, he could not know. He collapsed against the hood of his car, gripping the metal as if it were the only solid thing in the universe. Minutes later, Helen arrived in her own car. She ran to him, her hands on his shoulders, eyes burning with fear and relief. He wanted to speak, but words caught in his throat. The adrenaline was too raw. Together, they drove back to her house, silent at first, the storm outside drumming against the windshield. When they finally sat at her kitchen table, papers and radios scattered between them, the silence broke. They pieced together what he had seen, fitting the masked figures into their growing puzzle. Every document, every signal, every hidden photograph became sharper, more dangerous, more personal. Richard realized he was no longer an old man chasing curiosities. He was fighting something real. Helen's eyes caught his in that moment. He saw not just a partner in investigation, but someone who had stepped willingly into the fire with him. And though fear still clung to them, something else rose higher. Trust. And underneath it, the beginnings of love. Chapter 6. Traps and deceptions. The plan was bold, maybe reckless. They decided to turn the enemy's own tactics against them. Richard spent nights crafting false signals, disguising them with deliberate imperfections to make them look authentic. Helen smuggled messages through channels only she knew, weaving a net that would lead their adversaries into a place of her choosing. Each night they tested and retested, nerves stretched thin. They had to move carefully. One wrong note in a broadcast could give them away. Yet working together carried its own thrill. Their shoulders brushed as they leaned over the same set of papers. Their hands almost touched as they adjusted the dials. Each laugh at a small mistake carried more weight than it should have, because it wasn't just laughter. It was defiance in the face of danger. The trap was set near the waterfront, a place with plenty of shadows to hide in, but enough open space for them to control. The night it unfolded, Richard crouched behind a row of rusting containers, Helen at his side with a radio pressed to her ear. The signal went out. Minutes stretched like hours. Then headlights pierced the fog. Several vans rolled in, their engines rumbling like beasts hungry for prey. Figures stepped out, scanning the area. At first it seemed to work. The figures moved exactly where the signals had led them. But then, everything shifted. One of the men spoke into a radio, and suddenly Richard's device crackled with a new signal, one he hadn't made. His blood ran cold. They had been tricked. A false broadcast within their false broadcast. A mirror game. Helen grabbed his arm, eyes wide, breath fast. Trusted allies had betrayed them. Some of the people who had offered them help were nothing more than informants feeding scraps of truth back to the network. The realization hit hard, like a punch to the gut. Yet even in betrayal, they did not collapse. They improvised, slipping through alleys, cutting through abandoned warehouses, leaving the enemy chasing shadows. By dawn they had escaped, but the weight of deception lingered. In the quiet afterward, they sat together on a rooftop, watching the sun bleed into the horizon. Exhaustion pulled at them, but their hands found each other. No words were spoken. They simply knew. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Chapter 7. The lighthouse showdown. The storm struck like vengeance. Waves crashed against the cliffs. Lightning tore the sky in jagged scars. The lighthouse loomed as both sentinel and battlefield. Richard and Helen climbed the stairs 2 at a time, soaked to the bone, their breaths ragged. The higher they went, the louder the storm, and the closer the danger. At the top they found them, core of the network. Men and women with eyes cold and sharp, their confidence like armor. Documents lay on the table, computers still warm, evidence waiting to be claimed. The confrontation was electric. No more hiding in shadows. This was face to face. The exchange was brutal. Words sharp. Threats sharper. One of the leaders stepped forward, fury in his voice, demanding Richard and Helen leave before they vanished, like the others. But Richard, trembling yet unyielding, fired back with all the courage he had. They were not leaving. Not now. Not ever. The storm outside beat in rhythm with the chaos inside. Papers flew across the room. A lamp shattered. Lightning flashed so bright it burned their eyes. But in the frenzy, Richard and Helen managed to secure the files, transmitting digital copies through a hidden link Helen had prepared. Evidence flowed like lifeblood into the hands of authorities waiting far away. By the time the storm began to ease, sirens wailed in the distance. The network members scattered, some captured, some fleeing into the night. Richard and Helen stood together at the window, soaked, shaking, alive. They had won. Yet, as they looked at the empty seats where some of the vanished still remained unaccounted for, they knew the story was not finished. Some mysteries refused to be solved. Chapter 8. Reflection and Trust. The storm had passed, leaving the town washed clean yet raw. The streets smelled of wet stone and sea salt, gulls cried above rooftops, and people slowly crept back into places they had abandoned. Life was returning, hesitant but determined. Richard and Helen walked along the coast together. The sand was damp beneath their shoes, the fog rolling in soft waves across the water. Their bodies still carried the tremors of the confrontation, but now they had space to breathe. Richard looked at Helen and saw in her eyes not only the fire of survival but the quiet strength of someone who had chosen to walk beside him through darkness. He confessed in a low voice that he never thought life could surprise him anymore. Not at his age, not after the years of loneliness and routine. She smiled gently, her voice almost swallowed by the sea breeze, and told him the world never truly stopped holding secret. It was just that sometimes people lost the courage to look for them. And sometimes, if luck or fate allowed, two souls found each other in the process. That evening they sat on the porch of Richard's home, surrounded by radios that still hummed faintly with the static of the world. They ate simple food, bread and soup, but it tasted like a feast. They spoke of regrets, of paths not taken, of loves lost and found. Their hands brushed on the table and lingered. Neither of them moved away. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It was full, rich, alive with trust. Chapter 9. New horizons. The town had scars. Boarded windows, closed shops, whispers about what had really happened during those lost months. Yet it was alive, and so were they. Richard and Helen found joy in rediscovery. They revisited the lighthouse, no longer as investigators chasing shadows, but as companions standing where they had once fought for their lives. The waves below were calmer now, the sky brighter. They drank coffee from a thermos, leaning against the railing, watching the horizon stretch forever. At the library, Helen began quietly cataloging old signals. This time, not for danger, but for history. Richard helped her, his fingers steady as he sorted through dusty boxes of tapes and records. They treated it like a ritual, a shared adventure into the past that bound them closer each day. Sometimes they walked together through the market where vendors had returned, their voices once again loud and human. Sometimes they sat in silence on a park bench, not needing words. Their bond was not loud or dramatic anymore. It was steady, a fire that warmed rather than burned. They laughed more freely. They teased each other over minor mistakes. They planned small journeys, exploring the cliffs, the woods, the hidden corners of their town. The investigation had given them purpose, but what grew now gave them something deeper. Companionship bought love. The kind that made even quiet mornings feel like a gift. Chapter 10. Open Futures. One late afternoon, Richard stood on the cliffside, the sun glinting off the wide ocean. The water shimmered as if holding 1,000 unspoken promises. Helen stood beside him, her scarf whipping in the wind, her eyes reflecting both light and peace. He asked her if she thought they would have ever discovered all this without the chaos that had consumed the world. Her answer came softly, but it struck deep. Sometimes life grows silent, so we can finally hear the signals it hides. Sometimes the heart waits until the world feels impossible, and only then does it open itself to adventure, courage, and love. They turned back toward town, the streets stirring with life, children running, voices rising, windows opening. For the first time in years, Richard felt that the town was not just a place where he existed, but a place where he belonged. And he knew this. Age had not stolen his capacity to feel alive. Together he and Helen had uncovered darkness, fought danger, and found each other. The horizon was open, full of risks, full of secrets, full of possibilities. And they were ready for it all.